With pro-democracy forces now wide awake and surging in terms of their numbers and courage, dug in on one side, and Donald Trump with his band of autocratic enablers on the other, the country in some ways feels like it's engaged in a game of chicken, waiting to see which side's going to blink first. A stare down, if you will, where the stakes are nothing less than the future of American democracy. Today, though, following the fatal shootings of two people in Minneapolis at the hands of federal immigration officers, and subsequently the breathtaking durability and scope of protests from ordinary citizens braving the bitter cold to protect their neighbors, hitting the pavement in protest all across our country day after day, it is the Trump side doing the blinking. Now, why could that be? Well, because the gears of democracy, cobwebs and all, are finally creaking back into action on three separate but important fronts today. First, in state houses from coast to coast, New York Times reports this, quote, ever since the second Trump administration embarked on its large-scale deportation efforts, Democratic-leaning states have proposed and passed, in some instances, countermeasures, such as banning masked or unidentified law enforcement officers. Last month, a dozen legislators from 7 states announced that they would coordinate legislation in 2026 to complement the litigation already being used by Democratic attorneys general to challenge immigration policies. But after the killings of both Mr. Preddy and Renee Good, a resident protesting ICE's presence in the Twin Cities, those endeavors have gained more urgency. That's according to lawmakers and immigration rights groups. The jet fuel possibly animating that urgency happens to be the second of those three fronts we talked about. That is us, the American people at large, in growing numbers, because voters right now are making it abundantly clear that they are not interested in waiting the 9 months between now and the midterms. They're using their feet, they're using their body. They're putting Donald Trump and the Republicans on notice that they do not approve of what they're doing, especially the extreme immigration measures being carried out against human beings, including American citizens, in the name of the American people. Tomorrow at this time, it's possible, it is likely that we could be covering widespread protests, and possibly there's some talk that we could also be covering some general strikes in some parts of the country. There's a third front, our justice system. Just in the last 24 hours, judges in separate cases have acted decisively to try to rein in the seeming impunity of Donald Trump's immigration policies and authorities. In one instance, a federal judge in Minnesota ordered the government to cease detaining and deporting refugees who were lawfully admitted to our country and immediately release those currently held for reexamination of their cases. In another, a federal judge picked ICE apart. That judge said that ICE has violated nearly 100 court orders as part of what they're branding as an aggressive crackdown. From that ruling, quote, this list of violated court orders should give pause to anyone, no matter his or her political beliefs, about who cares about the rule of law. ICE has likely violated more court orders in January 2026 than some federal agencies have violated in their entire existence. ICE is not a law unto itself. ICE has every right to challenge the orders of this court, but like any litigant, ICE must follow those orders unless and until they are overturned or vacated. These three buckets, these three avenues of pressure are clearly registering with Donald Trump and the White House. As part of that game of chicken we talked about, Donald Trump is going about some subtle changes to his immigration language and his enforcement policies as the pro-democracy forces in America muster their might ahead of tomorrow and whatever comes next. That is where we start today with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. Publisher of The Bulwark, host of the Focus Group podcast, Sarah Longwell, is here. My friend and colleague, senior political analyst, contributing host of Pod Save America, host of the podcast Runaway Country, Alex Wagner is back with us. And former top DOJ official, legal analyst Andrew Weissman's here as well. Sarah Longwell, let me start with you. What do you see happening in the country in terms of the public mood?
Well, I listen to voters week in and week out in focus groups, and I cannot overstate how big of a shift there has been on just Minneapolis. And one of the things I want to start out with is just the fact that everybody knows what is happening. You know, I talk a lot about what it takes to break through in this noisy information environment. You know, voters often, we will be talking about something on the show or in Washington, and voters won't have heard about it. Not only has everybody heard about these shootings, but everybody's seen the videos. They've examined them for themselves. And people were already deeply uneasy after the shooting of Renee Good. But to have a second shooting with Alex Preddy, where I got to say, for voters, the Preddy shooting is just much more clear cut. They looked at the Renee Good one, and, you know, people were able to tell themselves, well, she was in the car, and how was the car turning? The masked agents, 6 of them jumping on Alex Preddy, shooting him in the back, him clearly having his hands up, just trying to defend a woman that an ICE agent had shoved into the snow, has created a really different environment where people are now saying they are fed up with these sort of over zealousness of these ICE agents, the fact that they're paroling the streets in masks, the backlash. And look, obviously, hardcore Trump voters, many of them will stick with him on this, but the vast majority of the country is just reaching kind of a tipping point on not only do they think this is wrong, what is happening, right? They hired Trump to secure the border. They hired Trump to deport dangerous criminals from the country, but they did not want this, people in our streets. The other thing is, Donald Trump is not doing the thing that voters hired him to do the most, right? If the economy was booming and people's prices were going down, sometimes voters can forgive Trump for a lot of the things he does in that context. But at a time when Trump is not addressing their concerns and he's creating chaos in the streets and they're shooting Americans, that's when you start to see public opinion really start to move.
Sarah Longwell, the child separation practice has been, thanks to people like Jacob Soboroff and other great journalism and activists, has been part of the Trump story. But to your point, people are now focusing in on the plight of young children like Liam Ramos, who was not just detained in Minneapolis, but used as bait to lure out other family members at a time when, to your point, everyone has seen the images of how Alex Preddy was killed. I wonder if the whole project of going after the worst of the worst has now been blown apart as a lie.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a few lies, actually, that American voters understand. And again, I just can't overstate how interesting it is to me to hear Trump voters, and many of the people we've been talking to have been Trump voters, talking about Ramos, talking about, I mean, they know these stories, and many of them are calling for Kristi Noem to be impeached or gotten rid of, which I was actually pretty surprised to hear Trump voters saying. Now, these are swingier voters, people who went from Biden to Trump, but they say this idea of using kids as bait, of going into schools, of going into churches, these are the kinds of things that Americans reject. They say, yes, get dangerous criminals, but somebody who's been here for 20 years, like, don't come into our streets and start dragging our neighbors out. Like, they want a policy solution to it, but they do want people to be treated humanely. Like, the American people have not lost every sense of what is decent and what is right. And they think that using kids as bait is wrong. Separating kids from their families is wrong. That was true in the Trump first administration, and it's true now.
Sarah, I think we have some footage from your focus groups. Let me play that for our viewers.
Whenever there's a highly publicized police shooting, and it's getting publicized because there's questions over whether it was a good shoot, I think in law enforcement, there's usually well, you have to put yourself in that moment. You have to understand they were making a quick decision. You have to understand, like, the law enforcement is usually quick to, I don't want to say defend, but kind of explain or justify why it was a good shoot or a bad shoot. And over the last few weeks, months, year, it's getting harder and harder for people around me to have like a good faith conversation about why something was a good shoot. I don't know anybody who saw the video. The most recent one in Minneapolis.
ICE has single-handedly set police back easily 100 to 50 to 100 years. Easily. I'm glad that I medicaled out, because I would kind of hate to be a cop right now because you're dealing with, because what one badge does, everybody gets blamed for it.
Now, Sarah, explain who these voters are.
Yeah, so we just did this group last night, and these are law enforcement officers. Some of them are correctional officers, many of them are beat cops, some of them are federal law enforcement, but they're all people who have operated in law enforcement communities, and they did all vote for Kamala Harris. We are doing two groups. We're going to do another one tonight of people who, let's say, are more Trump friendly, and we'll see how different those are. But in this particular group, it wasn't just that they were all talking about how this made law enforcement look bad, how it broke trust with the people that they're supposed to be protecting. You could also just feel like they were sad. They were devastated by what was happening. Like they're cops who feel like their duty is to protect people. And I think watching, especially for law enforcement, and I think you're going to hear more of this, watching people who are not trained, who treat people horribly, who shoot, quickly and thoughtlessly and taking American lives and creating chaos in the streets. They view that as something that is going to, because ICE are not the same, right, as the police officers that we deal with every day, or Border Patrol is not the same. But they feel like what it is going to do is break the trust between the American people and law enforcement writ large, and that's something that you can't just get back in a day.
Joining us, the Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner of Virginia. Senator, thank you for being here. First off, why is Tulsi Gabbard there? What could she have to do with this case?
Well, Katie, I want to get to Tulsi, but let me just say about the raid itself. Your previous reporter is right. You can try to get a search warrant. But there are two facts that also ought to be reported on this bizarre raid. One is that it's been reported, at least, that the FBI head of the field office in Atlanta, which includes Fulton County, has suddenly either quit or been fired. So to me, that smells like the local FBI guy didn't think this passed muster. And we need to get the answer on that. And traditionally, when you bring a search warrant like this, the person who is prosecuting the case is the local U.S. attorney. Well, the U.S. attorney that signed on this search warrant to go to the judge is the U.S. attorney from Missouri. So if you talk about something that, at least at the front end, smells really bad, and the concern from the local officials about what is going to happen to their election returns and data, this thing stinks. Then we get to Tulsi Gabbard. And again, your reporters are right. Her job is to look at foreign interference in our elections and to oversee all of the bad guy efforts in terms of spying. And the remarkable thing that needs to be reinforced to all of your listeners and viewers is that Tulsi Gabbard, over this last year, has literally taken apart what was called the Foreign Malign Influence Center, the center inside the intelligence community that was supposed to look at potential voter interference. Because, again, she's still been an election denier. She is a sycophant to Donald Trump. The speculation, at least up here on the Hill, is that, she's done such a dreadful job that she's been excluded from most of the national security activities of the last couple of months. She's never been up here to brief, on Venezuela, Iran, or Greenland, you name it. And maybe this is some feeble attempt to get back in the good graces of her boss, Donald Trump, and to feed into his obsession about losing the 2020 election. That is at least some of the speculation up here.
That's interesting. There has been talk in, I guess, some of the more conspiratorial corners of the internet and MAGA world that the capture of the Venezuelan president would lead to him admitting or revealing evidence about how Venezuela was able to target and manipulate ballots through like Dominion, et cetera, voting booths, voting machines. Do you have any reason to believe that that wrinkle is part of why Tulsi Gabbard might be in Georgia?
I can tell you this. All of this speculation has been investigated. Is there a hypothetical case that new information can come about, or is it potentially, as your reporter said, some of the conspiracy theorists had suddenly say there was a Italian satellite that was beaming in, and the stuff that I'm not even sure Laura Loomer, the crazy right-wing troll, it's the kind of stuff she would advocate. But I've had no indication, and in a normal administration, as somebody that was very involved in election interference and frankly gave the first Trump presidency kudos for running a safe election in 2020, if there was some new information in a normal administration, they would have an obligation to report that to the Intelligence Committee, of which I'm vice chair and was formerly the chair.
Now, let me play Donald Trump in Davos talking about the 2020 election.
It was a rigged election. Everybody now knows that. They found out. People will soon be prosecuted for what they did. It's probably breaking news, but it should be. It was a rigged election. You can't have rigged elections.
Are you concerned that this raid on the search of the Fulton County Elections Office, that it's going to be used as a pretext come 26 or even 28?
Yes. The first few months of the second Trump administration, when people asked me this question, I wasn't that concerned. I am more concerned now. It is absolutely critical that we protect the integrity of our elections, make sure these are still run state and local. I'm even concerned that some of the agencies that used to help states get up to snuff, are they so politicized now that they could undermine states' efforts? There's a ton of questions that I never thought we'd have to ask in this country. And, maybe this week, as we're seeing the White House and some of the Republicans find their spine about the abuses that are taking place with ICE, maybe some folks will be willing to stand up for our democracy. But I can tell you from the Intelligence Committee standpoint, and making sure we monitor the foreign interference and then also make sure any other activity, we got to stay on it. And one of the things that I think we need to make sure that is included in any kind of ICE reform is we don't want these roving patrols of ICE agents suddenly showing up at polling stations during primaries or general elections. We may have a major vote in Virginia about redistricting. That's got to be a reform as well. The level of intimidation that the feds could bring on voters all across the country, if it doesn't worry you, it should.
So is that on the table right now as well? Let's talk about DHS funding. Is that on the table as a reform necessary for Democrats to vote for a funding bill?
I and others have added that. We've talked about roving patrols. When we're getting rid of roving patrols, saying not only knocking on people's houses without a warrant, but coming to a place like a polling station shouldn't be that far. We don't know what's going to happen. I think the ball is now in the Republican court. Matter of fact, they could only get 45 of the necessary 60 votes to move forward. So they got an issue. If we can split off the other 5 bills, which are 85-90% of the additional government spending, and then take some brief period of time to get these ICE reforms in place, I want to look at that. But that's what's being discussed. But it's we don't get to put that bill down. We don't get to put that plan down. It's up to the Senate Majority Leader and Donald Trump. There's indication that the White House is supportive, but I'm in a trust but verify mode. Until we see it, until the bill's on the floor, until I can see what the reform package is going to look like, I got to see those first.
Yeah, I've been hearing that a lot lately, trust but verify. You talked about your Republican colleagues a moment ago, and I do think this is an interesting moment. We are hearing more forceful pushback, and it's usually from someone who's retiring or one of the more likely voices or usual suspects like Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins. And yes, we're hearing it from those folks. But you just mentioned they can only get 45 votes for this DHS or this full spending package. That means that there were Republicans that are not signing on. Do you think that we are at a tipping point?
Some of those Republicans, well, I would hope so, although I thought we were here many times. I would, before I get too excited about some of the Republicans who voted against it, these were the kind of far-right Republicans who talk about things but then never want to vote for any government spending. So I'm not sure we can read too much into that. But let's see. One of the reasons why I think this is changing, in a weird way, I mean, this is just pure speculation, the fact that the storm has kept, 2/3 of Americans kind of in their houses for the last couple of days, even folks who supported Trump, chances are they saw the video. So when the Kristi Noem or other of these kind of the goon squad folks that have been talked about come out and say that Mr. Preti, Alex Preti, was somehow a terrorist or whatever, they can see that's not the case. Their eyes are not lying. An ICU Veterans Affairs nurse who took care of wounded veterans. I think that helped drive home the point. Now, I'll just give you a quick little Virginia-based effort. Hanover County is a suburb outside of Richmond. It's a very, very conservative county. Last night, because of an overwhelming turnout of voters in Hanover County, the local county board voted 6-1 to not have ICE build a facility in their jurisdiction. That is a sea change from 6 months ago, and I think it shows that even folks who supported President Trump are now saying, particularly on this issue, they don't want an agency running amok, and there needs to be guardrails. And the idea is that Americans are getting shot in the streets. What happened in Minneapolis can happen in Richmond or Norfolk. It can happen in Albany. It can happen in Indianapolis. You name the city where Trump and this rogue agency at this point could be detailed next.
Yeah, it has. That video of Alex Preti does have some of the hallmarks of what has traditionally been, a real changer, a real driver in a change of public opinion, which is that everybody saw it. I think you're right to point out that everyone was inside, or a lot of us were inside because of the snow, that it was easy to understand. It was easy to see what he was doing, and then very easy to understand that the administration was lying about what he was doing, Alex Preti. That in itself goes a long way to piercing what had seemed to be an impenetrable bubble regarding, what the administration would try to tell us and what people would believe. Yeah. Senator Warner,
and I know you're think it. Thank you.
Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Katie. No, I was going to say. Remember, it does come on top. It does come on top of the craziness with NATO and Greenland and. Yeah. The question of taking 20% of the fleet off the coast of Venezuela to blockade Venezuelan oil tankers. A lot of folks are saying, this is not what I thought we hired this guy for.
The administration backtracking from its early loud claims, like these over the weekend, that agents had acted totally correctly in the killing of Alex Preti and other recent controversies. Tonight, the story is that they admit there were mistakes. And the new official that Donald Trump just sent to Minnesota, Tom Homan, rejecting the type of Trump defenders, including within the administration, who had been insisting initially that this was all an acceptable operation.
I do not want to hear that everything that's been done here has been perfect. No agency or organization is perfect.
Not perfect. It's a step that shows the pressure is working. And I will show you right now how that is measurable and why it's not the whole story. And we don't take anything from any government simply at face value when they're under this kind of pressure. But the street protests and Democrats using new tools in Washington and in the back room and sometimes public pressure from a growing group of Republicans, all of this adding up. Republicans see that gunning down Americans is not popular, to say the least. A growing majority of Americans now say ICE has gone too far. This is new polling from none other, if you look in the lower left, than Fox News' polling operation itself. Now, Trump officials are changing their rhetoric, and they're claiming there are changes to the orders for ICE agents. Now, you think about the aggressive and escalating stance they have taken towards citizens on the streets. That's changed. They're now, according to Reuters, instructing ICE agents to only do what Trump on the campaign trail said would be the entire operation, only target immigrants with criminal cases. And they are forbidding other activity. As they're told here in all caps, quote, do not communicate or engage with agitators. Now, that's a written order. It could be changed very soon. It could be leaked or promoted to the press to try to offer something right now. But let's be clear, this written order admits the flawed approach that those agents were taking up until now. And if the administration later waters it down and reverses it, if they think that's the way to go after outrage may have cooled or people move on to other controversies, you remember when we were talking about invading Greenland? Well, this new order will still provide a public written baseline that advocates and others can try to hold these agents to, because just to say the obvious, the job of ICE agents is not to engage with agitators or patrol citizens and communities all day long. That has nothing to do with enforcing immigration customs, which is what ICE does. Republicans know they cannot outrun voters in this year's election, even if they can avoid town halls right now. And the reports are House Republicans fuming about DHS Chief Noem's leadership. Dems want to impeach her over the killings and these public safety failures. Remember, when the government comes in and kills people in avoidable ways, whether or not it's ever deemed a murder in an investigation, it's a public safety failure. The government is making things worse, not better. They're leading to Americans' deaths. And these are failures that vulnerable Republicans are aware of, Axios reports, putting them in this painful spot. Now, can Democrats actually break MAGA Republican loyalty to force, say, a vote on impeaching Noem, on removing her? And then could they even win over enough votes to do so, asking Republicans to defy Trump? Well, is it possible? We know the answer is yes. That legislative situation just happened a few months ago on Epstein. That was an issue where Donald Trump demanded loyalty. But by the time the Democrats built pressure and then forced a House vote, well, we know what happened. By the time it reached the Senate, Trump could not get the Republican leader, who you see on your screen, to even slow the process, to do him a solid. He also couldn't find a single senator to object. So it flew through the Senate, passing unanimously, Trump losing badly. That is a legislative history that haunts the White House's congressional whipping operation. Now, both these issues, of course, have victims, which do provide major stakes. But to be clear politically here, when I'm talking about how Congress works, the comparison is not that these issues are, quote unquote, similar. The thing that's similar is Donald Trump's weakening grip on congressional Republicans. We know that his congressional wall already cracked. So avoiding a vote to remove Noem is one thing. And the White House asking Republicans to dodge public statements might buy them some time. Asking them to pretend things are okay, you can see some Republicans are saying, we're not going to do that. Others may be a little quiet. Give them a couple days. That's part of politics. Unfortunately, even when there's politics involved in whether we're going to deal with the government killing Americans. But here's the point I'm reminding you tonight. If there is a no confidence vote in Noem's leadership, if Dems could force that by peeling off some Republicans, the same playbook they did on Epstein, well, that's a whole nother issue. Because some Republicans are already signaling they want her out, that they could vote to do it. And others, when faced with the no confidence vote, don't exactly want to stand up and put on record, not knowing how many more Americans could be hurt, endangered, illegally detained, or killed, that they are fine with how things are going. Even Tom Homan says he's not fine with it. Now, Democrats are still in the minority, but they can fight. They have other extra tools if they want to use them. And that's, remember, what many Americans have been demanding across what is now this very clearly extreme second term, where Donald Trump's not doing the things he campaigned on. Prices are up. Problems are rampant. He's not just targeting the violent criminals who might have come over from other countries. He's not doing what he said he would do, but he is doing other things that some people underestimated or didn't think he could do, unleashing these kind of politicized, possibly illegal, definitely violent operations only in places largely where he thinks the opposition is, going off and indicting people he disagrees with, trying to crack elections as we know it. If enough people are under investigation or on trial or imprisoned, it's hard to have free and fair elections. And while anyone can quibble with one or two cases, and we try to report them all fairly, Donald Trump has now put over 14 people under investigation, including 2 members of the Federal Reserve. Nobody seriously thinks this is on the level. Well, what's striking here is that Minnesota has shown how the pressure is working, how people are standing up and showing courage even as they've seen others gunned down in their very community. These mass protests and civic support groups are showing strength in the cold, strength in numbers, resilience that harkens back to a long American tradition. And that's just in Minnesota. We know there have been protests across all of this past year. They have broken records. The ability to hold these protests is a guardrail that people are using, as I've been reporting, even though we also have to tragically report that this government has tried very directly, admitted an agenda against the First Amendment, against peaceful protests, with federal agents menacing people, threatening them in broad daylight, and yet the people are marching. That effort, along with the particular way that facts and journalism and the terrible videos of some of these incidents about what the Trump agents are doing, has driven up the opposition I showed you. Trump's ICE plans are opposed by 59% of the public, and that's in Fox News' accounting. That's plus or minus 3. You could call it 62%. It's only getting worse. And these are people that include, statistically, folks who have been Trump voters in the past. Pressure works.
Breaking this hour on Capitol Hill with less than 30 hours before a government shutdown, MS Now reports that a deal is circulating among senators to pass 5 spending bills that would partially fund the government. A separate 2-week stopgap bill would also be included to temporarily fund the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, while senators negotiate a broader deal that would include new restrictions on ICE. Joining us now is Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. He serves on the Homeland Security Committee.
Senator, thank you for being with us. Maybe you can tell us at this hour, where do negotiations stand? We do understand that this agreement, if there is one, would still need to pass the House. That could be difficult for some conservatives. The House is also not currently in session. Is the government going to partially shut down tomorrow?
There is a deal, so far as we know, Simone, and there may be a vote on it in the Senate as early as tonight. It would give us an opportunity to impose real restraints and reform on the Department of Homeland Security and, in particular, ICE, but would avoid a government shutdown. And the House can pass this measure before midnight tomorrow and avoid that government shutdown, but still enable us to take strong, meaningful, enduring legislative action, not relying on Trump executive orders. No talk. We want action. And we fought down, as a matter of fact, the amount of time that we would have to arrive at these reforms from a longer time to just 2 weeks.
Senator, the reality in this moment is driven as much by the politics of a potential yet another government shutdown, but also by the realities of the killing of 2 American citizens in Minnesota, the aggressive foreign policy of this president with respect to Venezuela. And all of these things have narratively worked against the administration. But more importantly, it's worked narratively against your fellow Republicans in the Senate, who are worried about their particular positions, yes, but also their reelection, those who are up this year. I would say that there's probably a brood, I like to call them a little brood, of Republican senators who are ready to make this deal. Word this evening is that seems to have been taking shape. Senator Thune is saying, well, I got to get it in front of all of my members, but we're doing the stroke. Are you confident Republicans are going to be in play in a way in which they're going to have the votes that you're talking about counted on and counted for tonight or tomorrow whenever it happens?
Never confident about anything in the United States Congress, but I am hopeful.
Fair point.
Because they're hearing the same anger and outrage from the country that I am hearing, and frankly, that I feel. And rather than making this issue about a government shutdown, about failing to pay military families or making air passengers safe, we're taking off the table the government shutdown, and we're going to, frankly, force real reform. And it has to be a lot more than putting lipstick on a pig, to borrow your very colorful analogy. It has to be real, lasting, enduring legislative reform that applies the same standards and practices that constrain any local or state police. When I was Attorney General of the state of Connecticut for 20 years, there was a right of action against state or local police. They had to wear identification. They couldn't wear masks. They had to wear body cameras. And the idea of their being above the law, reckless and lawless, the way ICE is, would have been unimaginable. And my Republican colleagues have to just look at their local law enforcement and listen to their constituents, and they will come around to these reforms. There's nothing novel or original about them.
Senator, part of those reforms is reckoning with the leadership that has put these policies in place. Earlier today, Leader Jeffries was talking about Stephen Miller. I want you to take a listen to what he had to say.
Stephen Miller is the architect of Donald Trump's toxic immigration policies. He's a stone-cold liar. He's a bigot. He's a hateful individual. He's a malignant, unelected interloper. He needs to go as well.
Will you fund DHS if Noem and Miller are still in place?
I'm going to work to remove them because these violations of rights come from the top. You know, the secret memo that I revealed last week, done by the acting director of ICE, shows that these violations of rights, the physical assaults, the knocking down doors in homes and smashing into homes, arresting and detaining people without judicial warrants, these policies come from the top, from Noem, from others like Steve Miller, and I will not vote for another penny of funding for DHS unless there is meaningful institutional reform, practices and policies that restrain this agency in a meaningful way. It's more than just one person, although I agree with everything that Leader Jeffries has just said about Steve Miller. Removing Steve Miller fails to remove Donald Trump. And we need to recognize that as long as there are other people around him who would advocate the same lawlessness, these policies will continue. And, you know, we're going to continue to spotlight these issues. Next Tuesday, I will have a hearing that involves the relatives of Renee Good. They will come to the Capitol along with other victims of shooting. These kinds of violations of rights, the physical assaults, the brutality, are not limited to Minneapolis. They span the country.
So then what do those meaningful reforms look like, Senator? Because I think Americans listening to you would say, we agree. But one, what are they? And two, how do you enforce them? Because I hear you saying to Alicia's question that you agree with Jeffries that Miller and Noem have to go. You yourself have called for Kristi Noem to resign and step down. But in the event that they don't, you're saying that many of the same heinous policies will still be in place. So I think just a layperson listening is like, well, then what is Congress here for? What are you all going to do?
We're going to shut down the Department of Homeland Security if there are no meaningful reforms and restraints, if there are no changes in the people who run this agency, not a penny more. We have 2 weeks to achieve these reforms. They wanted a longer period of time. We fought them down to 2 weeks. But to go to your question directly, I would vote to impeach Kristi Noem, along with others in that agency, and I hope that movement will continue. I've said she has to be fired or resign or be impeached. We need a house cleaning in this agency.
That's clear.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a big challenge here, Senator, to sort of piggyback on Simone's point is when you look at the two individuals involved, Kristi Noem is a Senate-confirmed appointee of the president. Stephen Miller's not. He's just a presidential appointment. He works at the pleasure directly of the president. So the idea of getting him out of the mix really kind of goes to your broader point about others being in that space as well that still will continue to push these policies. So then you are left, I would assume, with no other choice than to say to the administration, because this department is as rogue as it must stop. And if you don't stop it, we will, is essentially what you're saying. Because you're not, let's be honest, Stephen Miller's not going anywhere. You can't fire Stephen Miller. Only the president can. You can impeach Kristi Noem, all right? So you can get half of that apple, but the other rotten part is still there. So you're still going to have to leverage that against the funding that this administration wants for DHS.
And we have to stop that funding if this agency is out of control, a paramilitary force like we have never seen in the history of the United States. It was exactly what the founders said should not be tolerated when they passed the Fourth Amendment that precludes smashing into homes without a judicial warrant. We need to require judicial warrants for those arrests. It was exactly what they said should be required in the 10th Amendment, as you pointed out earlier, giving state and local officials the right to prosecute murders when they occur by ICE agents. There has to be a prompt, immediate investigation, independent of the DHS. And body cameras on, masks off, unmarked cars ended, and the kinds of quotas that we see, which are an institutional cause for even the best of the ICE agents, even the honest ones, to start making these mass sweeps and arrests. The overhaul of this agency has to be legislative, not relying on executive action.